Hi everyone, I'm back, and today we're continuing with another DIY project. This time, I'm going to build an antenna starting from something most of us have lying around, an old phone charger that's been forgotten in a drawer. What looks like junk at first glance can actually turn into the starting point of a surprisingly interesting project. And for the first step, I'll remove the charging circuit inside, so it can be connected to the antenna's signal receiving section. To make the connections easier, I'll drill 6 holes in the charger casing, with the positions carefully planned in advance. Even though the 6 holes are already drilled, the edges aren't perfectly smooth. That makes it harder to reinstall the charging board in its original position. So I'm using a knife to trim away the excess plastic around the holes. The signal receiving section made from copper wire is very effective, but its structure for capturing radio waves is fairly complex. From the preparation stage, each piece of copper wire has to be cut to the correct length, followed by a fabrication process that requires a high level of precision. That's why this step needs to be done carefully and without shortcuts. Even a small inaccuracy can affect the overall performance of the antenna. In the previous video, I came across a comment from a viewer asking about this type of hot glue. It's actually a glue I use quite often in my DIY projects because it's easy to work with, sets quickly, and is flexible enough for many different assembly situations. For small parts or applications that don't require heavy load-bearing strength, hot glue is a very convenient option. For this homemade antenna, when connecting the charger to the other components, I prefer using thin gauge wire because it fits the space better. That said, thinner wire is also easy to break, so the handling needs to be a bit more careful and precise. In a moment, I changed my mind and decided not to reuse the charging board anymore. Not because it doesn't work, but because I suddenly remembered a comment from a viewer. I can't recall the name, who mentioned that the charging circuit inside their phone charger didn't work at all. So in this step, I'm using this phone SIM instead to replace the original charging board inside. And did you know that wrapping the SIM with aluminum tape can be surprisingly effective? It helps keep everything firmly in place and also provides decent conductivity and shielding. That said, when wrapping it, I still leave the metal contact area exposed, so it's easy to work with during the connection step later on. At this step, don't get me wrong, I'm not using the knife to damage the SIM, but simply to roughen the surface slightly, which makes soldering easier and more reliable. For those who may not know, in my left hand I'm holding solder wire, which helps the solder joint flow better and stick more evenly. All right, the homemade antenna assembly is now complete. Now it's time to put everything back in its proper place. To get the signal from the homemade antenna to the TV, we need to add a dedicated connection component for this setup. And that's where coaxial cable comes in. This type of cable is known for stable signal transmission, low loss, and good noise resistance. When connected properly, a coaxial cable helps preserve signal quality as it reaches the TV, instead of ending up weak or inconsistent like with improvised connections. There's hardly a better choice than using an old power socket as the base for this antenna setup. Structurally, a power socket already has a sturdy plastic housing, good durability, and a stable shape, which makes it well suited for use as a base. Inside, there's enough room for routing wires and securing components, helping keep everything neat and organized. Most importantly, it's easy to find, inexpensive, and perfectly matches the DIY mindset of reusing items that might otherwise be thrown away, but still have plenty practical value. After connecting one end of the coaxial cable to the power socket, I'll then prepare the other end by attaching connector, making it easier and more secure to connect the antenna to the TV. For connecting the coaxial cable to the TV, I'm using two types of connectors, a straight F connector and a 90-degree F connector. Depending on the available space and how the cable needs to run behind the TV, I'll choose the appropriate one to keep the setup neat and avoid unnecessary bending or stress on the cable. There's nothing left to worry about now, so I'm taking this out to test it right away. It only took a few seconds to pick up the TV signal, but to be sure, I'll wait a bit longer and see how stable it stays. I've been waiting for a while now and haven't noticed any issues at all. So I decided to unplug the connection and plug it back in to see how it performs. So at this point, we can slowly bring this homemade antenna project to a close. Starting from old parts that most people would consider useless, through each step of disassembly, adjustment, testing, and even moments where I had to stop and rethink the approach, we've ended up with a setup that works reliably. For me, what matters isn't just receiving a TV signal, but the entire process of building it by hand, understanding why it works, and learning something useful along the way. DIY doesn't always require expensive tools or complicated components. Sometimes all it takes is a bit of patience, careful attention, and the willingness to try. The result may not be perfect every time, but each experiment adds experience and confidence. And who knows, a small project like this might spark ideas for many other things you can create using what's already around you. Thank you for taking the time to watch this video all the way to the end. If you found this project interesting or helpful, feel free to save it for future reference. It might come in handy when you least expect it. I'll see you again in the next DIY video. We'll continue experimenting, learning, and turning everyday items into something new.